Since we're talking about the philosophy of physics, often philosophers of physics will say that many physicists don't have a conceptual understanding of what they're speaking about, whether it's GR or most of the time it's quantum mechanics from my conversations on air and off air. So, what does it mean when someone understands something conceptually? And how does one go about if one wants to increase that muscle? How does one increase their conceptual understanding muscle?
That's a really good question. Um, okay. So let's see. Certainly, I would say from the kind of quantum foundations perspective, increasing your conceptual understanding it is about, I think, understanding what's going on beyond just saying I can predict what's going to happen. So there's this kind of operationalist point of view, which is all you should ask of a theory is that it makes predictions. Um, so I think that's a very poor image of science because if you gave somebody an oracle that would just answer yes no questions, it would serve the same purpose. Like I could ask it a question and, is this thing going to happen if I do this experiment? Yes or no? It answers it. I get everything that an operationalist says a scientific theory should give me. But the problem is that's not really what I want out of a scientific theory. So if I want to cure cancer, I don't even know what question to ask, right? I don't know where to start. I need to have a model of like, what is where do I start on this problem? And I can't just reduce that to answers to yes, no questions. It's because I have like a conceptual image of what's going on. And so, in other words, scientific theories don't just answer questions; they provoke questions, right? They tell you what the next question you should be asking is. So, people who have different views on the interpretation of quantum theory tend to ask very different kinds of questions in their research. They tend to predict that we'll see, like if they happen to believe that there's going to be a breakdown in quantum theory at some point, they'll predict where that breakdown is going to happen very differently because they have very different conceptual understandings of what's going on beyond what an operationalist would say. So I think, conceptual understanding, that part of that could be, having a realist interpretation of what's going on. Often in a smaller context, like when you're looking at some phenomena, and you sort of, you follow the derivation and you say, okay, I guess I sort of understand where that result came from. But, to really understand it, like I'll often tell my students, like, if you can show another example of this phenomenon in a different context, well, then you're onto something. Then you've generalized the idea from the context in which you saw it to a broader context. That indicates some understanding. So, often like generalization is a good proxy for a deeper understanding. Unification, situating this phenomena as cognate with this other phenomena or another example of something, that's also important for understanding. So I think there's a lot of signatures that you don't just follow the derivation, you really understand what's going on.
Something I want to do with this channel, and I hope I have been doing, and I hope to do, is to have a positive influence on the research scene in the places on the themes that I interview about. So whether it's biology with Michael Levin or developmental biology in that case, or the philosophy of physics, for instance, with you, Jacob Barnes, Tim Maudlin, Sean Carroll, and so forth. And one of the ways to have a positive influence is to articulate something that hasn't been said much to the public. So the public has heard from people like Neil deGrasse Tyson that philosophy, maybe even the philosophy of physics, but let's just say philosophy sure, it was useful in the past, and sure, it maybe gave rise to science in some sense. Natural philosophy became physics, but then at some point, it loses its ROI. And I'm sure you've heard similar. I'm sure you've had, even privately, perhaps even publicly, arguments about this. Can you make the case for me? Make my life easier. Why should we not discount the philosophy of physics? What is it providing us?
I would say maybe rather than focusing on the academic discipline, like the departments of philosophy that employ philosophers of physics, let's kind of focus on the culture of philosophy of physics. So there's people in physics departments who are doing philosophy of physics, right? So often people studying the foundations of quantum mechanics are taking a much more philosophical approach to physics than typical physicists do. So I want to maybe defend that methodological stance, which is like, let's ask the kinds of questions that are typical of natural philosophy. Why is that useful to do in physics? Um, and I think again, sort of like when we're talking about methodological questions, it's not as if evidence data will solve this, but we can look to history and say, well, what sorts of approaches have been beneficial in physics? And so if I look at the really big revolutions in physics, they all came along with, they were instigated by people that were thinking very philosophically. And they also often came along with radical changes in how we even think about science. So a lot of revolutions in physics also meant revolutions in the philosophy of science. Okay, so Newton and Einstein in particular with relativity and quantum theory. I think that how we even thought about what a scientific theory is changed as a result of what they were doing. And of course, they were very interested in philosophical questions. So, on the other side is when you look at some of the best progress, in the 20th century and more recently, it was sort of technical sophistication that led to that progress, and not thinking about deep questions about the nature of locality or relationalism or anything like that. And so that's sort of the kind of the bias we might have these days in physics department is that so some of the recent progress, you didn't need to think deeply about philosophical issues to make progress. But what I like to tell students who maybe come with that attitude and say, "Oh, I don't know why foundations of quantum theory is so important," I would say, well, when you compare the magnitude of the revolutions, you ask, well, what are the revolutions that were like really significant? They're the ones that I think touched on deep philosophical issues. That's my sense of it. That revolutions in physics that change what the nature of space and time are. That philosophers have talked about the nature of space and time for a long time. That's a very philosophical issue. It, I think they are more interesting, more significant than mere technical innovations. So yeah, I guess I would just say to students that it's good to be philosophically savvy if you really want to be part of revolutionary physics, right? You don't need to be philosophically savvy if you want to do good physics work, but revolutionary work in physics tends to require that kind of savvy. The other thing I would say, so that's sort of maybe one kind of answer. The other kind of answer is just that, so I did a degree in philosophy. I did a joint degree in physics philosophy during my undergrad. And what I would say I took away from my philosophy degree is not, the details of any particular philosophy. That's not what was important for me later. I would say in philosophy, there's a certain discipline about what constitutes a good argument. So you learn in a philosophy training, basically, if you're doing analytic philosophy, as I was, how to make an argument bulletproof, right? So how to define your terms carefully and how to explain things well, and how to see the errors in your own analysis, and how to go looking to criticize your own thinking. And there's a certain way of approaching argumentation characteristic philosophy. And at the time when I was doing both, I noticed that in physics, everything was much looser, that, we're going to make these approximations, not worry too much, let's try to get an answer. There was a lot less rigor about, is this argument a good one? What are the premises that this argument ultimately rests on? Can I articulate better the principles? Can I, dispense with some of the axioms that I'm using or the principles that I'm using in this argument? Like, there's a lot of things that in philosophy you tend to do to try to get to the essence of something. So you sort of learn to try to get to the essence of something. That, I think good physicists do that as well, but it's less a part of the training of a physicist, and it's much more the part of the training of a philosopher. So I think there's also just some skill sets from philosophy that translate well to the foundations of physics.
So you did your undergrad at McGill, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right. Okay. I didn't even know they had. So I did mine from the University of Toronto, which you did later for your master's and PhD.
Yes.
Okay. I didn't even know McGill had a philosophy of physics undergrad.
Well, no, they don't. So the situation was, so I started at McGill in physics, um, and even though I was sort of, my loves were physics and philosophy at the time, there wasn't really that option. But I met somebody in my first year at McGill, and he had done most of a physics degree, but wanted to change course, and he'd become interested in philosophy. And he noticed that McGill offered a joint honors degree in philosophy and English, philosophy and political science, philosophy and linguistics. Like philosophy gave you joint degrees with almost every other discipline, but there was no philosophy and physics.
Oh,
And so he went to the faculty of arts and science and said, "Why can't there be a joint honors degree in philosophy and physics?" And so they went to the Department of Physics and said, "Will you relax your credit requirements to set up this joint degree?" And the physics department said, "Absolutely not. There's no way we can relax any of these credits." And so then this guy went back and said, "Well, what if I did it in 5 years rather than 4?" And the physics department said, "Yeah, that'd be okay." So they made this 5-year program that was basically the physics curriculum, the whole physics curriculum, together with what was effectively a philosophy minor. And so when I learned that that thing existed, because he'd basically created it, I was like, "Yeah, that's what I want to do." So I enrolled for that.
super interesting. Okay, now you mentioned analytical or analytic philosophy.
Yeah.
Was there anything from continental philosophy, which I'm sure you had to study some, that influenced your physics?
Not really. No, I didn't have to study much continental philosophy. Um, I think I naturally gravitated to the analytic philosophy courses because they were sort of more clearly just useful and in line with how I was thinking. Also, there was a professor in the philosophy department. His name was Paul Petrosky. He was an amazing lecturer, and for whatever reason, he taught so many different courses while I was there. So I took his philosophy of logic and philosophy of language and epistemology and philosophy of mind and a long list of courses, and they were great. So I didn't actually have that much room for many more courses, but it was a great degree. I also got exposed to for the first time to the foundations of quantum theory in a seminar course on metaphysics. So it was the philosophy department where that kind of ignited my interest in the foundations of quantum theory. Because the seminar course, basically, we were reading primary material on things like the quantum measurement problem and Bell's theorem. And I remember, reading these things and then going back to my physics professors and saying, "Look, there's a real problem here." And they wouldn't acknowledge that there was a problem, and they told me that I was
Ah,
mistaken, and I just didn't understand what was going on. So yeah, the physics department really tried to persuade me not to work on these kinds of issues, but it was too late. I was already kind of hooked by virtue of my exposure in this seminar course.
what surprised you in the philosophy of language course?
That was a long time ago. Yeah, I thought it was interesting, the whole kind of analysis of language turn in analytic philosophy. Uh, Yeah, I mean, it had elements of kind of logic. When you take an ordinary language English sentence and you try to decompose it into something that's more logically precise. There exists a person such that that person is the king of France and they are bald. Like that those kinds of exercises. They're a small part of what I think is useful to do, which is often we'll have ideas and we'll try to express them clearly, and being able to sort of parse English sentences into things that are more precise and get clear on exactly what you're trying to say. Often the things we're trying to say in a paper on the foundations of physics are quite nuanced, and so you want to use mathematics. Like mathematics is a great tool for saying things very precisely. Ordinary language is another great tool, especially if you want to be understood. And in between, there's sort of a mix of, some signposts of ordinary language and then some formalism that is maybe the most effective at sort of really communicating. And so I think a lot of those courses in logic and philosophy of language helped me a little bit in terms of like, how do you make arguments understandable?
The Economist covers math, physics, philosophy, and AI in a manner that shows how different countries perceive developments and how they impact markets. They recently published a piece on China's new neutrino detector. They cover extending life via mitochondrial transplants, creating an entirely new field of medicine. But it's also not just science. They analyze culture, they analyze finance, economics, business, international affairs across every region. I'm particularly liking their new insider feature. It was just launched this month. It gives me a front row access to The Economist's internal editorial debates, where senior editors argue through the news with world leaders and policymakers in twice weekly long format shows. Basically, an extremely high quality podcast. Something else you should know about is that if you go to their app, they not only have daily articles, but they also have long form podcasts with their editors and writers. This is also available online. Whether it's scientific innovation or shifting global politics, The Economist provides comprehensive coverage beyond headlines. As a TOE listener, you get a special discount. Head over to economist.com/TOE to subscribe. That's economist.com/TOE for your discount.